Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, our final in our series on must-watch movies of the 1970s, we are going to look at the 4 big films that really revolutionized the genre in that decade. Each one of these films was not only successful at the box office, but also changed the genre and are pillars from which modern horror is really based on. Growing up with these films, they were referenced by my peers and older teenagers and were described as the scariest and most disturbing films that could ever be watched. One of these films I only got halfway through before I ran out of the room. Well, I was 9, maybe 10 at the time, but the images from that film were seared into my imagination for decades. In this episode, I'm going to try and do less plot summary than I have in previous episodes and try and do more of an analysis. At the end of the episode, I'll also list some honorable mentions of other horror films from the 70s that I haven't included in this series. The first film we were going to look at is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This film comes at the viewer with a level of horrific intensity that had never really been seen before in cinema. Yes, there had been gore in films before, like in the Herschel Gordon Lewis films like Blood Feast, 2000 Maniacs, Color Me Red, and The Wizard of Gore. And there have been violence in films too. 3 films in the early 70s that really pushed the limit in terms of violence were Soldier Blue in 1970 and both Straw Dogs and A Clockwork Orange in 1971. And there had also been other kinds of exploitation films that pushed the limit. But the level of intensity and brutality found in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just on the next level. As my friend Burn Power describes the film, it takes a chainsaw to the cool, naive hippie generation. Now, it concerns a group of teenagers that are traveling through the hot Texas landscape in order to look for an old family home. Director Tobe Hooper was working on a limited budget, and apparently filming those scenes in the van were horrible to do as there was no air conditioning in the vehicle, and you can kind of feel that in the movie. Now, after this group of teens encounter a sadomasochistic vagrant who ends up cutting one of them, they're really shaken up by meeting this kind of person in this foreign redneck landscape. The film draws on the sort of hip urban people encountering the backwards countryside that had been done in films like Deliverance. They will meet their fate, though, not in this old house that they find, but rather in this white-colored house that 2 of them decide to enter. Now, when the man Kirk gets hit on the head by Leatherface with the hammer and he twitches like a cow that's just been slaughtered, this is one of the most shocking moments in cinema history. Now, Pam, the other girl, falls into all these bones on the floor when she comes in. In fact, bones are everywhere throughout this house, both human and animal, and they're sometimes in intricate designs. And even worse, the killer, Leatherface, has a mask made out of dried human skin. This skin mask, and in fact the whole concept of the film, was based on the Ed Gein murders that happened in Wisconsin in the 1950s. But Leatherface has a brother, the sadomasochistic guy they had seen in the van earlier. Plus, there is a dad who serves a barbecue of a special kind, let's say. Sally, out of this group of kids, is the last one left, and she endures a horrendous torture at the dinner table, which now includes Grandpa, who is nearly a corpse that gets semi-resuscitated after sucking on the blood out of her finger. Sally, surviving to the end, sets a standard for slasher films of the future. In fact, her escape is one of the most satisfying events that I've ever witnessed in a horror film. The violence in the film is graphic, but it is actually more suggested than overtly gory. Again, this film symbolizes the naive attitude that many of the tune-in, turn-on, and drop-out generation exemplified. You gotta remember, back in the early 70s, many of those still hitchhiking down to San Francisco never made it because there were serial killers taking advantage of this situation. But the director Tobe Hooper got the idea when having to line up for a long time in a store and thought the process would speed up if he picked up a chainsaw and started cutting down the people in front of him. The whole vibe of the film makes the viewer want to take a bath and cleanse themselves. Another disturbing aspect is that some of the violence takes place during the daytime, and this kind of goes against the conventions of the horror movie structure of everything taking place at night. Leatherface became the first masked icon of the horror, paving the way for Michael Myers, Jason, and Freddy Krueger. There have been sequels and remakes, but nothing comes close to the original. The film is still very disturbing to watch, and paved the way for modern horror films that featured overt violence. The next film that we need to look at is Carrie. The film was based on a 1974 novel by Stephen King. It was actually, the concept he got was from two girls that he knew in high school. And he almost gave up writing the novel, but his wife Tabitha really pushed him to finish. The novel started selling well, and then it was turned into a film in 1976, directed by Brian De Palma. Now, the film changed some of the aspects of the novel, but it generally stays true to the story. The film deals harshly with the theme of bullying, and it was one of the first horror films with an emphasis on teenage life. Carrie White is a 16-year-old girl who is friendless and is bullied by her peers. She lives with her mother, who is a religious fanatic who did not even inform her about the changes that happen when she becomes a woman and will go through menstruation. In the opening scene, Carrie, who's played an amazing performance by Sissy Spacek, gets her period in the shower and she thinks that she's bleeding to death. The girls in the locker room bury her in tampons and towel, yelling to plug it up. Carrie's mother beats her when she hears about the incident, saying the first sin is intercourse. But Carrie also realizes that she has telekinesis, the ability to move objects with her mind. After the bullying gets worse, a teacher intervenes on Carrie's behalf and punishes the bullies to a detention of endless calisthenics. One of the girls feels guilty, and another rebels and vows to take revenge on Carrie. Sue convinces her star athlete boyfriend, Tommy Ross, to take Carrie to the prom. Chris, on the other hand, convinces her boyfriend, Billy, paid by a very young John Travolta, to kill a pig and fill a bucket of blood to dump on Carrie. Carrie's mom does not want her to go to the prom and is convinced that her daughter is possessed by the devil after realizing that her daughter has the power to move objects. The climax of the film is one of the most harrowing I've ever seen in cinematic history, with the split screen. Now, the viewer is made to feel sympathy for Carrie throughout the entire film, and we do want to see the bullies get punished. But the revenge that is given is so brutal and shocking. I mean, we wanted revenge, but not this way. The film Dogville by Lars von Trier gives the audience a similar experience. Now, this film ends in absolute tragedy, with a little bit of a shock at the end. The teen-oriented flicks in the 1980s and the 90s owe a debt to Carrie. The film had a sequel in 1999, and a made-for-TV remake in 2002, and a cinematic remake in 2016. There was even a stage production released in 1988. Brian De Palma's film is still an absolute masterpiece that truly captures the harsh social environment of being in high school. I cannot recommend Carrie enough.
Already said I would.
Tell that boy you're not going, or we're going to move from here.
No.
We'll move from here and you'll never see that boy again. Lorraine's coming in.
Mom, please sit talk to
Let it
me.
close the window.
Mama, I'll get him. Please sit talk to me. I'm going, Mama. Things are going to change around here.
I'm not a philosophy expert, but I know the ancient Greek philosopher Plato came up with this concept of the form. From what I understand, the form is the essence of something, or the perfect conceptual archetype upon which everything should be based. With that concept in mind, I would say John Carpenter's Halloween is the form of a horror film. Well, at least the form of a slasher film. In fact, this film is the perfect slasher film, and in my opinion, all other slasher films have been trying to live up to this film's perfection since then. You can tell I'm a big fan. Now, there have been numerous thrillers, Italian giallo films, exploitation films that had, killers wielding a knife, Psycho being the most famous, and there have been films, with mass killers and babysitters being attacked, like Fright or The Town That Dreaded Sundown, and of course the aforementioned Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Bob Clark's Black Christmas, who I looked at earlier in the series, had a very big influence on Halloween, but Carpenter's 1978 classic is the film that defined the genre. It also led to the horror movie boom of the late 70s and early 80s. Now, the film starts out in 1963 with a 6-year-old boy named Michael Myers witnessing his sister go upstairs and have sex with a boyfriend who leaves shortly after. And then we watch everything from Michael's perspective as he puts down a clown mask and picks up a butcher knife. Then he stabs his sister to death. Taking its cues from Psycho's Norman Bates, we have a killer that has something sexually traumatic happen in his development, usually related to family, and that causes that person to become a killer. 15 years later, he escaped and is pursued by Dr. Loomis in a great performance by British actor Donald Pleasance. And he is fanatical about capturing Michael, who he feels is the essence of evil. Laurie, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, who was in fact the daughter of Janet Leigh, who was the shower victim in Psycho, is a nerdy girl who studies a lot, and she gets followed by Michael, who's now donned an eerie-looking white mask. Her sexually active friends make fun of her prudishness, but Michael makes his way through the houses, and it'll be them that will be killed. Tommy, the boy Laurie is babysitting, swears he sees the boogeyman, which is in fact Michael Myers, but Laurie does not believe him. Laurie comes into direct confrontation with Michael, and boy, he will not die easily, despite her best efforts. This movie sets the standards. The stalking of each victim, the good girl who survives, and the killer who won't die, making the concept almost verge on the supernatural. Another factor is the safe suburban neighborhood that is the perfect setting, as the tranquility of this kind of environment gets invaded by an evil external force that preys on the vulnerable. Now, this film wouldn't have taken place in a tough inner city neighborhood. There was a fairly decent sequel that came out in 1980, and then a film with a completely unrelated story that came out in 1982. There was in fact an idea that this would be a kind of anthology series with a different concept for each movie. However, after that film was released, Halloween 3, that idea did not really come into fruition, and then there was a bunch of sequels with Michael returning, and there was a remake by Rob Zombie, but none of them could ever match the atmosphere of this film. Now, the film was one of the highest grossing independent movies of all time, as the budget was fairly low, but the viewership was high. Now, main actress Jamie Lee Curtis appeared in several other horror films like The Fog, Prom Night, Terror Train, Road Games, and in also Halloween 2. And she became known as the Scream Queen, a title that took her a while to shake. Another amazing aspect of the film was the music, especially the theme song, which were all the music and the theme song were composed by director John Carpenter. This film uses music as brilliantly as Dario Argento's Suspiria, and it matches the atmosphere and it really heightens the tension. I cannot say enough about Halloween. It made a really deep impression on me the first time I saw it on video, along with Dirty Harry right afterwards, when I visited family in Scotland in the summer of 1985. I would argue that all modern horror films that have been made since 1978 are in debt in some way to Halloween. Now, the last film I'm going to look at in this series is the one that made a greater impression on me than any other film, horror or not horror, I've ever watched in my life. It must have been either the summer of 1983 or 1984. I think it's 1983. My mom and my two sisters were visiting the UK, and I was staying back with my dad in Toronto. My friend came over for a sleepover, and we actually, for fun, we set up a tent in the backyard to sleep in, like we were camping. Now, my friend looked over what was called the Broadcast Weekly. It was like a free TV guide that came with the newspaper and showed us that The Exorcist was on and that we should watch it because the blurb said it was guaranteed to give nightmares. Now, my father did not need much convincing to let us watch it, as he was more interested in staying in the backyard and drinking rum and cokes. Now, we started watching this film. What I witnessed absolutely terrified me. Now, this concept of a girl being possessed by the devil or a demon had me beyond shocked and disturbed. What really unnerved me at first was the images in the dream sequence where a white face appears on the screen. I'd never seen anything that scary. However, it got worse. When Linda Blair, who plays Reagan, the main girl, started growling and turning pale white, I had to look away. But boy, When her head did a 180 turn, I ran out of that room. My friend soon followed. Now, that night, sleeping in the tent, I'm looking over at my friend. It's very dark, and his face looks as pale as Linda Blair's. Let's just say I did not sleep well. I was so terrified of this movie, I didn't even want it mentioned. Even like the Mad Magazine parody, I didn't want to see. Everything associated with this movie terrified me. Now, eventually I watched the rest of it on an old black and white TV we had in an upstairs room. I was not the only one that was freaked out. Apparently, when this was released in 1973, there were people who had heart attacks, threw up, and there was even a reported miscarriage in the theater. Now, the movie was massively successful, and it was a worldwide trend. And even the Pope commented on the influence that the devil had in the world, apparently because of the effect that the movie had in the press and the hype around it. Evangelical preacher Billy Graham actually thought the actual physical film, was possessed by Satan. Now, I'm going to do a lot less of a plot summary here, other than to say the film's about a 9-year-old girl who gets possessed by the devil, it's a demon called Pazu, and her mother turns to priests for help after the world of psychiatry can't help her. Now, the performances by Jason Miller, Max von Sydow, Ellen Burstyn, and Linda Blair are all excellent. Especially Burstyn's performance as the emotionally frazzled mother really stands out. Now, the demon's voice is done by Mercedes McCambridge, who was a heavy-smoking actress, and just a great match to the voice that we see. Now, the sounds in general are unnerving, and there's these growls and backward sounds, and then, visually there's these flying objects around the room, and we just get this sense of chaos. And it's understandable just hearing these sounds and seeing these images why people are actually sick in the movie theater. But then there's also the physical vomiting of what looks like green pea soup that Reagan does all over the priest. Now, the final confrontation between the two priests and the demon is completely harrowing and disturbing. All I can say is please watch this movie. I've watched this movie numerous times, and, it still kind of haunts me to this day, even though I'm very used to it. There have been sequels, but they cannot match the sheer terror created by the original. Though I would say Exorcist 3 is actually a pretty good film, but not scary like this one. The film was re-released with unseen footage in 2000, and it actually included a really shocking scene where Reagan walks down the stairs like a spider. Now, I've seen a lot of horror films, but nothing will ever compare to this, and maybe because I was 9 years old at the time, but I saw the scariest horror movie basically as one of my first horror movies, and nothing could ever compare. And I actually would argue this is the scariest movie of all time.
Come forward and answer me now. Are you the person inside of Reagan? Who are you?
Now, I know I looked at a lot of movies in this series, but there's so many more that I've left out, and there's hundreds of movies, maybe thousands between the years 1970 and 1979, but I'm just going to do a quick list of honorable mentions, films I didn't look at. So please check these out also. There's Last House on the Left, there's A Bay of Blood, Shivers, Dawn of the Dead, Silent Night, Bloody Night, The Tenant, The Other, Rabid, The Severed Arm, Axe, Haunts, When a Stranger Calls, The Hills Have Eyes, The Brood, Amityville Horror, The Omen, The Abominable Dr. Phoebes, Willard, Burnt Offerings, Zombie, Alien, Race with the Devil, Frenzy, Blood on Satan's Claw, I Spit on Your Grave, The Sentinel, Theater of Blood, The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane, The Shout, Psychomania, The Witch Who Came from the Sea, Rituals, Al-Qarda, and The Possession of Joel Delaney. I know I've missed a ton of movies. Please check out all the movies that I've covered in this series. I hope I haven't done too much of a spoiler for any of them. Now, in my opinion, the 70s was the richest cinematic decade, especially for mainstream Hollywood. And there were so many horror films that produced that decade that were absolutely magnificent. Again, if you got an opportunity, you can find movies on YouTube, you can find them on Tubi. Please go back and look at these films. They are great classics, and they just don't make horror films like this anymore. Okay, so thank you for watching this series. Please like, share, and subscribe. And thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. I will be back with a new series soon, or I may be re-releasing some of my old series with some edits. Thank you.